All right, online classes for the summer of 2019. We're moving on now to Chapter 13. So with this recorded lecture, we'll be down to 2 more chapters that we'll cover. So our comprehensive final will be over chapters 1 through 15. So here we turn to Chapter 13, the Presidency. You'll see at the very beginning of this chapter an interesting review of what elections mean for the presidency and how a particular president will manage bureaucratic offices within the executive branch. And the one that's brought out here is the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. And so spend some time looking over this particular quote, and then you can also see just a lengthier discussion about the ability of a president to manage segments of the bureaucracy. And that's part that doesn't get as much attention in our review of this office as we might see on our nightly news, for example. So that's an important part to read. Well, we have a lot of rankings in the United States, as I'm sure we're quite aware. You can go online and get all kinds of rankings at any given time. This is a fairly consistent ranking of presidents. I think many of these presidents we would be familiar with. You may find some charts that might have a name or two that are not on this particular list, such as I've seen James K. Polk on the list, might replace Ronald Reagan or Andrew Jackson. Generally, it's the same group, though. The first 3, for example, I can't think of a chart that I've ever seen that did not have those 3 ranked as the top presidents. We can probably get a sense in our knowledge of American history why these presidents are in this ranking. They're generally presidents that have had a very aggressive use of the authorities of the executive branch of the president and have led the country through some difficult times. Now, could there be ways to avoid those difficult times? And there's no doubt the president that we see ranked 10th on this list, that's what he was very well known for, was to avoid or to make sure that the country would not have a war, and was able to make some positive changes in infrastructure and in advancements in science while he was president, looking at Dwight Eisenhower there, president from the 1950s. And so there's been some reanalysis of what he did while he was president. And that, of course, continues to happen for all these individuals on this list. There's an ongoing review on the strengths and weaknesses of the presidents. Same can be said of the bottom 10, why these were not successful presidents. And there's a continued analysis of whether or not they should be on this list. 2 names, actually 3 names, that I can see here that there's been some reviews of recently, and actually, when I say recently, in the last, well, really 30 or 40 years, that would perhaps indicate that there needs to be a continued analysis of these individuals and their presidencies. The ones I'm thinking of are Grant, Nixon, and Hoover, that perhaps they were more successful than was first suggested. But generally, many of the presidents that are on this list continue to be there. And notice that you have one president that was the only one in our history to have resigned while in office. That was Richard Nixon. And you have 2 presidents that bookend the presidency of Lincoln. And so Lincoln came in after James Buchanan, who's number 1 on this list. And the president that replaced Lincoln is number 3 on this list, Andrew Johnson. Now notice here, this is the oath that a president needs to take, and most presidents will swear. We've had one president affirm, and that was William Howard Taft, who had some different religious issues or religious beliefs than most of our presidents. But I think it's important to see here that the basis of this oath is to protect and defend the Constitution. But what does it mean to defend the Constitution? So, and this is perhaps a bit of a rough picture to review here, but we've had a Supreme Court justice that has said the Constitution is not a suicidal pact. So, in other words, are there some times in which following the Constitution may be harmful overall to the country? And that, of course, gets into a very difficult terrain to start to think that way. Now, clearly, notice something about the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. He clearly did think that way and believed that what was most important was to preserve and save the country, not so much to just strictly follow an interpretation of the Constitution, even if it meant harming, and as far as he was concerned, the overall country. And this picture, by the way, is after the Boston Marathon bombing happened a few years back. How best to respond or to prevent terrorist attacks? Might it mean that you don't necessarily always follow the Constitution? And as we can imagine, that gets to be a very questionable type of behavior, because a president could start to act as if the president would always need to act a certain way in order to prevent greater harm. Considerable powers for the presidency, as we can see here, they're described there in your text. And we can see that there are situations in which one individual has that authority. We just mentioned in charge of the bureaucracy. The early part of this chapter points that out. In control of the EPA, can call Congress into session, can veto a bill passed by Congress, makes all kinds of appointments, is the one who would negotiate and make treaties with other countries. And an absolute authority is to grant pardons on federal issues. Commander-in-Chief of the military, notice there that this is the individual who is making the decisions when it comes to military actions, but declaring war is an official duty of Congress. So we can see here that there's ways in which presidents can interject themselves into the legislative process of converting a bill into a law. We've had some presidents that have not been too successful at that. As we can notice here, Andrew Johnson was at a time in which there was a sharp partisan difference between the control of Congress and his presidency. But overall, we can see in most cases presidents have success when it comes to vetoing legislation. This is dated now, so I believe it's changed some, but you have over 2,500 vetoes and only a little over 100 of them have been overridden. Some overwhelming success for some presidents. I don't know if there's any president that has had this much success at vetoing legislation. So 414 vetoes in the first term of Grover Cleveland and only 2 overridden. There are ways, though, as we can imagine, to limit presidential power. You can think about Chapter 2 in our text and the issue there of checks and balances, and again, that a lot of evidence that Congress was intended to be the most powerful of the branches of government. But here we can see some of the other ways in which a president's power can be limited. Bureaucracy, Supreme Court, the public, the press. You can certainly think about political parties as well, other countries that can do that. Of course, the public, through public opinion, can also limit a president's power. Here we can see the War Powers Act. It's a detailed law that every president since 1973 has argued that they don't need to follow it. And we really don't have much of a situation where Congress has ever tried to limit what a president has done if that president has decided not to really follow the War Powers Act. How much information should a president give to Congress when it comes to using the military? Now, without a doubt, I mean, one of the things that Congress can do, and extremely reluctant to do this once you have military personnel in a combat situation in harm's way, but Congress could just decide not to continue spending money on that military event. We've got to believe that in almost any instance that Congress is going to be reluctant to go that route. But that is their ultimate power in this relationship, to be able to stop a president. So the War Powers Act can be used as a way to limit the power of the president. But we can see this becomes more complicated as technology changes. Does the War Powers Act even need to be utilized if you're talking about non-human military activities, such as drones? Best example would be drones. If the military personnel in question here is roughly 10,000 miles away using a joystick in some air-conditioned bunker in San Diego to direct a drone that's flying over Yemen in the Arabian Peninsula, what military personnel is potentially being harmed? And of course, this is not Yemen here that I'm bringing up, but the North African country of Libya, which President Obama argued there was no need for the War Powers Act to even be considered, because there were no uniformed military personnel involved in Libya. There were both military hardware, unmanned craft like the drones, and then CIA or other secret military, semi-military personnel not wearing uniforms that were involved in Libya. So there was no need for the War Powers Act. One of the things that we can see fairly consistently here is that this supersedes partisanship, that you have presidents who are now thinking of the institution, not their political party, and they consistently would argue we don't need the War Powers Act. They have that power as commander-in-chief, and it should not be interfered with by the legislative branch. So it's an ongoing conflict for sure, but we do know that the last official declaration of war was World War II, and just think of all the military conflicts we've been in since that time. And so should there be a way of getting Congress to have more power in the war-making ability? Not a whole lot of qualifications to be president. These are the three that are listed in the Constitution. That's it. So the idea that you need to have a certain amount of education, experience, not there. So this is what you have. And there's only one of these three that's really brought out in somewhat of a question that's not clearly defined, and I think that's fairly obvious for all of us, that would be the one on natural born citizen. And we can think about that one a little bit, but I'll move on here. But just to see the fairly consistent, actually very consistent descriptions of our presidents that we can see here in terms of gender and then ethnicity there, and even religion for that matter. Not a whole lot of difference that we've seen here. One other point to make about natural born citizen, we don't really know what that means. I mean, it's fairly consistent interpretation to mean that you're born in the United States or some territory that's controlled by the United States. But we don't have an absolute definition of what that means. And we would perhaps not get that until we have a president in which that's going to be questioned. Then it could be challenged to the court, but then the court probably wouldn't take it up because the person's already president. So I'm not really sure if we can ever firmly define that. And I bring that up because in 2016 we had a senator from Texas running for president, trying to get the nomination of the Republican Party, a man named Ted Cruz, who was born in Canada, but his father was an American citizen. Is that enough excuse me, I believe it was his mother that was an American citizen, but born in Canada. So would that be enough to say that you are a natural born citizen? You're not born on U.S. territory, but you have a parent that is an American citizen. Is that the definition? We wouldn't know unless he had been elected president, and even then would the Supreme Court have reviewed the case. So there we go, some review of what it means to be a natural born citizen. Here we can see some of the different backgrounds of our presidents, and the fact that there hasn't been, other than the fact of Barack Obama, not a whole lot of difference among the presidents. This is an area here that is not brought out in your text, so I do want to emphasize that. Ways of looking at presidential character, the personality structure of a president. And it's really based on two different areas, their outlook and their activity level. They have a positive or negative outlook, and are they active or passive in their activity level? And James David Barber was a political scientist from Duke University, and he put this description together. So should you think about the personality of the individual when you are casting your ballot, and you're thinking about which individual you would vote for? So according to Barber, this best personality would be the active positive. High activity level and a very positive outlook. And these are individuals who have a good sense of humor, they're willing to joke about themselves, they're willing to change their strategies or their policies if they believe that something else is going to work and is better. They're willing to admit mistakes. And Franklin Roosevelt is oftentimes considered a president that would fit that personality. Now, the interesting thing that I'll describe here is that we'll have presidents of each one of those groups, of the four different personality characteristics, four different personality styles, I should say, of James David Barber. But each one of those presidents that I'll use here would be on that top 10 list that I had provided earlier of the top 10 presidents. So Roosevelt, active positive. Passive positive, you have Ronald Reagan. Need to get that picture up there a little bit bigger than that, but I think we can find some pictures of Reagan. A successful president, but a passive individual according to the personality style of Barber. Now, one of the questions here is, is that really his personality style? Could that have been his health? Or could that also just be a way in which we didn't effectively analyze how he was interacting with his staff while he was president? Passive negative, Dwight Eisenhower, again, top 10 president, successful president, but perhaps not really as enjoying the presidency. And I should point out, passive positive with Reagan, that means it's a successful president. He was a successful president. But it's describing an individual who, while that individual enjoys being president and has a positive outlook, has a tendency to allow other people to really have more power and control in the White House. And a passive negative president is an individual that does not really enjoy being president. Now, this picture here belies that idea. And once again, there's that question, is this personality style an effective way of looking at this individual? Eisenhower had 2 heart attacks while he was president. So did that explain more than his own personality? It's his physical health. Did that explain his outlook? And then you have Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is an active negative. Should point out that according to Barber, this is the worst personality style. And these are individuals who are not willing to compromise. They're not willing to change their positions. They're very stubborn about that and always think that they're right. And you can see here that they work quite a bit, but they don't get much satisfaction out of that work. And so Woodrow Wilson would be in that category. However, he too, just like the other 3 presidents that I mentioned, some possibility that Alzheimer's has already started with Ronald Reagan while he was president, heart attacks with Dwight Eisenhower, and a stroke for Woodrow Wilson. And so maybe that explained his personality more than some sort of psychological makeup. But those are the 4 personality styles: active positive, active negative, passive positive, passive negative, and the presidents that we can see that are connected to that. So there can still be a successful president that may not have the best of the personality styles, according to Barber. You know, with all this discussion about the presidency, is it possible that really what we're describing here is that there's not much control that the individual has over whether or not that the person's presidency, that individual's presidency, will be successful? And I'm struck here by a quote to the Emperor Napoleon, and a very effective general. And he was asked one time, what is the greatest attribute of a general? And Napoleon said, luck is the greatest attribute. So for these individuals who are president, are they really in control of the fates that happen during their presidency? Or is it a fact that, or is it just a case that some are more successful just based on the times in which they're president? I think we'd like to believe that there is some ability for an individual to have control, at least some level of control, over his presidency. These are advisors to the president, and we have different levels here. We can imagine that there are some people who are more contact with the president than others. These are generally considered people such as the inner cabinet. We'll talk about that. Some of the key parts of the White House staff, and also some of the key advisors from the executive office. You can read about these different types of advisors to the president on pages 529 to 533. These are the inner cabinet positions. And so these are people that would interact with the president on really almost a daily basis. So just these are the current people. Would be worthwhile to know their names. So consider a potential war with Iran, which is in the news, would be a massive step to take. What clearly the individual in charge of diplomatic relations around the world, the Secretary of State, would be involved in that. How to come up with funding for this particular war. That would involve the Treasury Department. The ability to manage the different segments of the military would involve the Defense Department. And then the legal justification for such an activity would involve the Attorney General. So all 4 of these cabinet positions would be involved in such a massive undertaking, but would be involved in many activities that would be in contact with that president on nearly a daily basis. We do have a situation in place to determine whether or not a president is physically or mentally able to do the job. We've never really had to carry this out, but the 25th Amendment has been in place since 1967. It would involve activities with the cabinet and Congress to make that determination. You are replacing a president who has been constitutionally sworn in to be president, whether that's through other aspects of becoming president through resignations or an election. So the process then of removing that individual is extremely important and can suggest that you're having an overthrow of the government. So it does need to be something that's accepted by a good portion of the public. But what does it mean if you have a president that is just physically unable to do the job, has had a stroke, is incapacitated, is in a coma? So there's where you would see the need to have a replacement in a fairly quick and orderly fashion. As we mentioned before, it's not really a pleasant thought, but 30 minutes away from a nuclear holocaust at any given time. And so massive changes could occur in a very quick way, and somebody has to make some extremely important decisions very quickly. We're left wondering if what we've seen in this country has been an ongoing shift of power from the elected body like Congress to one individual who is still elected, of course, but increasingly gaining more and more power. And is that what we continue to witness, the power of the presidency and that one individual? And in some ways, that's a similar shift that occurred in the Roman Empire, away from a republic in which no one person would have too much power and would not have any power more than 1 year at a time, and two, you would have an emperor that would be in charge throughout that one person's life. And what does that mean for the future here for us? It seems like, I think it would be something to say that we need to be vigilant about that possibility. So that's our coverage of the 13th chapter, the chapter 13, the presidency, and we'll be moving on now to the bureaucracy, chapter 14.